From the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis, this is Indiana Issues. Here's your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz.
Hello and welcome to Indiana Issues. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Lots of things to get to today. Reaction to the recent shootings in El Paso, Texas, as well as Dayton, Ohio. Inspector General clears Governor Holcomb of ethics wrongdoing, and back to school in Indiana. And join us to talk about those and a couple of other items as well. Our political panel, we got our reporters in today. Eric Berman, 93 WIBC Radio Network Indiana. Eric, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Lindsey Erdody, political reporter for the Indianapolis Business Journal. Lindsey, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And from a local political newsletter, otherwise known as Importantville, our good friend Wren. Adam, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right, well, let's go ahead and start on a serious note. The nation's still reeling for the mass shootings that we saw in Dayton, Ohio, El Paso, Texas, killing at least 30 people. Has reignited the debate about gun control, about access to weapons, as well as those who suffer from mental illness. I know, Adam, you're right about a lot of things on the national front. What are you hearing as part of the national discussion on this issue?
You know, I don't think that we're going to see the universal background checks bill that passed the House on a bipartisan basis earlier this year. I don't think there's an appetite for it right now in the Senate. Senator Young and Senator Braun were in town yesterday and told reporters that they didn't see this as a starter. So I think red flag laws are going to be something that are much more probably palatable across the partisan divide.
Eric, let me jump over with you because Indiana Congresswoman Susan Brooks sort of offered up at the national level the Indiana version of the red flag law, which basically says there's an individual with mental health issues or possibly a danger to themselves, law enforcement and the courts can step in as long as there has been due process. That legislation didn't really get as far as she wanted to because I think it would have provided funding for communities and states to actually sort of pass those sort of red flag, Jake Laird laws. Let me get your thoughts.
Right. They're talking about not so much having a federal red flag law, but doing it at the state level. That seems like some form of red flag law, either an actual national one or that kind of state funding. That looks like the most likely thing to pass. I was one of those reporters who talked to Senator Braun and Senator Young, and both of them are bending over backwards to try and keep options open. They're both like, I'm not ruling things out. Senator Braun in particular is saying I'm willing to listen. But the two things that they were most clear on was they really don't like universal background checks, and they both are ready to endorse today a red flag law. That might have some bipartisan support.
Liz, let me get your thoughts on this discussion that we're having now.
Yeah, it seems like what we're hearing a lot from the Republicans is when they're talking about anything specific, at least, they're going to red flag laws. But I think it's also interesting, the Indianapolis started kind of a roundup of all of Indiana's congressional reactions, and some of them haven't said anything, and that's Democrats and Republicans. We haven't heard from some of them on it, and some other members of our congressional delegation didn't have anything specific to point to, but just kind of said, to your point, they're open to listening, they're open to hearing things, they think something should be done, but they don't know what that is yet.
Let's go to our screen and let's take a look at some of the reaction that we did actually get from some of the members of the congressional delegation. Greg Pence saying now it is time for us to come together and take action against evil and hate, thanks to the swift response by law enforcement and first responders in El Paso and Dayton who saved countless lives by putting their own lives on the line. Andre Carson, who also chimed in, saying the recent mass shootings make it clear the urgent need for real substantive gun safety reforms. I'm going to continue to work to pass more gun safety bills in the House, like the assault weapons ban and a federal red flag bill like we just mentioned here, similar to Indiana's Jake Laird law. But the most interesting comment I thought was this one by Indiana Congressman Jim Banks, saying, I've deployed to Afghanistan as a response to radical Islamic terrorism. We now face a different enemy that has also emerged from the shadows but demands the same focus and determination to root out and destroy. Hashtag white supremacist terrorism should be named, targeted, and defeated. Adam, let me start with you because Jim Banks actually got some pushback for that tweet that he sent out following the shootings in El Paso and Dayton.
Yeah, I was really struck on Sunday watching those responses come in, and really, Pete Buttigieg didn't say much else different than Jim Banks, at least in that respect. They both pointed out those ideologies as problematic. I thought it was really brave of Representative Banks to share a sentiment like that on Twitter. And of course, later in the day, he pointed to the political leanings of the shooter in Dayton, who had leftward leanings. Still, there's no sign that that was something that motivated the shooter in that particular instance. So he kind of did a both sides across the span of a Sunday. But I think that verifiably he's right, that this is a problem. You saw Tucker Carlson on Fox News this week basically say that white nationalism isn't a problem. It is a problem, and it's objectively a problem, and it can be measured in terms of hate crimes over a course of a period of years.
Are you surprised, Eric, that the pushback that Jim Banks got for the comments that he made?
Stunned, honestly. I mean, it's a sad day when it's an act of bravery to condemn white supremacy. I mean, come on. I mean, this shouldn't be controversial, and apparently it is. I'm shaking my head over it. And to the Tucker Carlson point, I mean, there's 22 families in El Paso who would disagree that it's not a problem. There was a time shortly after 9/11 when there were polls showing that only 10% of Muslims sympathize with radical Muslim ideology. And the response from those taking a more hawkish view was, well, 10%, how many millions of Muslims there are in the world? Well, if it's a tiny college football stadium full of white supremacists, as Tucker Carlson said, that's a heck of a lot of people who are a danger to this country. It's insane to refer to that as a hoax.
What was the pushback? Actually, I missed that.
Just in some conservative circles, it was a thought that if you express a conservative viewpoint, you can now be labeled as a white nationalist because you may disagree, with an issue or two. And so now, does that mean that just somebody expressing their opinion now has the potential to be labeled as a terrorist? Something I thought was interesting, Lindsey, too, when we have these discussions, is the quote, the whataboutism that always pops up. That, okay, well, what about these folks over here who said X, Y, Z, or what about X, Y, Z, as opposed to we sort of focusing on the issue at hand.
You mean in terms of, we're focusing on how to label it versus doing something,
exactly.
Which is what people in Ohio were chanting. Yes. Well, because that's what I was going to say about the Representative Banks statement. It did seem kind of like a bold statement for him to make, but again, it doesn't address okay, what are we going to do now? It was, to your point, just addressing, well, what is this? How are we labeling this? And like we saw in Ohio, I mean, there was chance of do something, and the governor came out the next day and said they were right. We need to do something, and he came out with a whole list of things that he said he's going to pursue now, and that's a Republican governor. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
You are watching Indiana Issues. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazi, editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. We're joined today by our panel, Eric Berman of 93 WIBC and Network Indiana, Lindsey Erdody from the Indianapolis Business Journal and of Importantville, and also freelance writer for Political, Wren. One possible solution that's been talked about to address this mass shooting issue are those red flag laws. Just a little reminder for our panel, there are laws, there are statutes that allow law enforcement officers to take possession of firearms from people they believe to be dangerous as defined by statute. However, a researcher read a story out of the State House file, one of our colleagues, questioned the jury is still out saying, do red flag laws actually work? But apparently, this may seem to be, and Adam, we'll go back to you, maybe the one point of this debate discussion that everybody can seem to sort of get around on an issue that usually has very big divides.
Yeah, and our red flag law was passed here in 2005 in Indiana, and we have more than 10 years of data that tells us that actually suicides by firearm have decreased 7.5% since that law has been in place. I actually think that if you look at the 18 states that have these types of laws, Indiana has one of the weaker versions of this law, and that's because the only kind of group of people who can take away somebody's firearm or have it petitioned to be taken away is law enforcement. In other states, families, people in the household are able to do that. And so I think, there is a case that some could make that Indiana's law should be strengthened. But, the data on these in a number of cases is pretty strong that they work. And so, is there one silver bullet solution? I don't think so. But these seem to be a palatable political answer to begin to solve what by all accounts scientifically is an epidemic of gun violence in the United States.
Eric, it's interesting because a lot of folks look at Indiana's red flag law, the Jake Lair law, as a possible model for the country. A lot of us, the three of us, Adam also, we spent a lot of time in the legislature. This was amended last year. A colleague of ours at WIBC Radio, Guy Relford, was one of the authors or helped write some of the amendments to the law. They said it made it tougher and sort of protected due process. Do you see Indiana's model and its law being picked up maybe at the national level?
I think it's very likely, and the key word there is due process. I mean, it's an area that allows both sides of the debate to come together, because the argument from Second Amendment advocates like Guy Relford is, look, people have a right to bear arms, but we don't want dangerous people with guns. We also don't want law-abiding citizens to lose their guns. That notion of due process, having a fact finder decide whether someone is a danger to himself or the community, that gives both sides an area of common ground. And again, with the whole Mike DeWine chance of do something, this is something that they can do. They may do more, but this one certainly has the best chance of passing.
Lindsey, I think it's ironic that of all places that may actually change federal gun law, it comes out of Indiana, just knowing the legislature and the people that we cover and deal with on a daily basis, and just how that issue tends to sort of sit here in Indiana.
Indiana can surprise you sometimes, can it?
Sometimes for good, sometimes for not so good.
Well, right. I mean, I think it is somewhat likely that this is the model we end up seeing, just because you think about, we have Mike Pence in the White House, and we've already heard from some of our congressional delegation that they think that Indiana's law is kind of the way to go. So I wouldn't be surprised. And I don't think it's necessarily ironic or surprising to come from a conservative state like Indiana, because the thing is, you have to have Republicans on board with whatever they're going to do in D.C. So, a law coming from a conservative state could, seem a little bit more
palatable.
Yeah.
Old Vulcan proverb.
Only Nixon can go to China.
I think Lindsey makes a really thoughtful point on that matter. One other interesting intersection today of Indiana and the national conversation about gun violence is that President Trump, in an interview that was published this morning, essentially pointed to Chicago as an example of why gun control doesn't work. The fascinating part about that, though, is that most of those guns used to come from Indiana, and that's because we have relatively weak laws around firearm protection. So 20% of the guns that are recovered in Chicago have come from Indiana, and so that's got to be a situation that is, I think, remedied if we're going to have a comprehensive solution as well.
Something else I want to throw in real quickly before we take a break here: the mental health component to this. A lot of the conversation has been we need to focus on mental health treatment. I just look at some data. 90% of the people in this country who are diagnosed with mental health issues are not a danger to anyone. Do they need care, treatment, and sometimes supervision? Yes, but they are not a danger. Does this add, this conversation, or at least when we look at the gun-related issue and automatically sort of tying it to mental health, sort of add to that mental health stigma for people who suffer from mental health issues but are not dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly doesn't help, and I think the converse of that is true. I mean, I don't have a statistic on this, but just as 90% of the mentally ill are not dangerous, some probably large percentage of those who are dangerous are not mentally ill. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's good to catch whatever that sliver is in the Venn diagram where they overlap. Those are people who should not have guns. But I don't think we should get our expectations too high that that's going to solve even a majority of the problem.
But I think one outcome of this could be more resources going into mental health, regardless if it's those people who are then going to, get guns and go attack people or not. More resources going into mental health is probably good for the overall, area to have more attention on it, because I feel like for a long time, it's just kind of been pushed to the wayside, and there's not a ton of resources and research going into it.
Do you see, Adam, more dollars, like Lindsey just said, more dollars, more resources going into the mental health area?
It's possible at the state level. Our budget at the federal level is now locked in for the next couple of years, and so that's not going to happen. But we just had a budget session here in Indiana, so by the time that it comes to really address this problem, the moment seems to have been passed, I think.
You're watching Indiana Issues. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. We come back and take ourselves a quick break. We come back. The Inspector General's office clears Governor Eric Holcomb of wrongdoing, and the immortal words of Rodney Dangerfield, it's back to school. You're watching Indiana Issues. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Indiana Issues. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazi, editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Our panel today consists of our reporter friends, Eric Berman, 93 WIBC Radio, Network Indiana, Lindsey Erdody, the Indianapolis Business Journal, and Adam Wren, who writes for Politico and also writes the political blog Importantville. Some good news for Indiana Governor Eric Holcomb this week. The Inspector General says he did not violate state ethics laws by accepting a couple of free travel to a couple of Republican governor meetings recently by a gaming company that was also lobbying the state during the time of the gaming thing was being discussed last session. On the one hand, some folks saying, "See, there was nothing here. There was never a big deal." Other people saying, "Well, duh, it's the governor's own Inspector General. He's not going to get his own boss in trouble." Eric, let me start with you.
William Sapphire used to say the real scandal is what's legal. I don't. It's tough to look at least the facts that were publicly presented and see where this one was going to create a problem under the laws. That doesn't mean it won't be a campaign issue. Carly Macer, who's looking at a run for governor, has already said that she'd center her campaign around issues of scandal and ethics, with this being one of the points that she's made. So we probably haven't heard the last of this, but when it comes up, Eric Holcomb now has a ready-made response. The IG looked at this. There was no wrongdoing. Nothing happened. There's nothing to be concerned about.
Lindsey, what about the issue of optics? 'Cause that's one of the other things that other folks would say is like, hey, maybe you didn't do anything, nothing illegal or unethical was done, but here is the governor. You got this massive rewrite of the gaming bill. He's accepting free trips. And I doubt if anybody's going to sit and actually read the 8-page, 46 footnote, Inspector General's report.
I think that's a good point because, yes, he can point to this report and say, I was cleared of ethical wrongdoing. But regardless of how it happened or who paid for it or who reported what where, because that's really what the Inspector General's report was about, you still took these flights with this major casino operator in your state who wanted something out of your legislative session and knew he was going to be wanting that. I mean, I think it was like the day after one of those flights was when he announced that he had acquired the Gary casinos. So this was in the works, and there's question about what was talked about on the plane, and we don't know. We weren't there. But yeah, the optics, still not great.
Do we run into an issue, Adam? Let's say obviously the Inspector General came back with its report. As long as people disclose, hey, the flight was disclosed, the conversation, the campaign financial disclosure, things were disclosed. Kyle Huffer put together a memo that was published in the Indianapolis Star. As long as everything is disclosed, is this a big deal?
I think that's not me to decide. That's for the opposition party and voters to decide that particular question. I think this is a rare instance of a governor who, for the most part, really seems to have a fingertip feel of how to read Hoosiers and how to kind of put forward what seems like a good government approach to his job. This is just, clearly like a mistake. You always think about the headline before you make a decision to do something like that, and clearly that seemed to be, absent from the calculation you made there.
Eric, when we get ready to start the 2020 campaign, of course, some people could say it started back in 2017 or maybe December of 2016. Take your pick. Do we expect the Democrats to make hay out of this, or is this going to be one of those things that is more it's inside baseball for the political class?
I think it depends on two things. I think it depends on who the candidates are, and I think it depends on whether it develops any legs. This hasn't really gotten a lot of attention up until now. It sort of flowered and died after the revelations came out in the Indianapolis Star. Carly Macer, as we said, probably will make an issue of this. I've not heard Eddie Melton or Woody Myers talk about it. That's not to say that they wouldn't, but so far that's not been the central thesis of their campaigns. So it depends on where the campaign goes. And ultimately, as both of you said, the point of disclosure laws is you can see what's going on and who they're talking to, and then voters decide if that's a problem for them.
Which now brings up the other question. I'll just throw this out to everybody on the panel. Does this make Attorney General Curtis Hill's day, saying, hey, if the Inspector General cleared Eric Holcomb, he also cleared me, so can I go home now?
Well, it absolutely does.
Very different circumstances.
Well, not only are they different circumstances, but they're very different IG reports. I mean, you look at one versus the other. The Hill report was about as scathing as a report could be without calling for criminal charges. So, yeah, I don't think that dog's going to hunt.
You got to throw it out there, just such a good measure. But let me ask you this: as Democrat, if you are one of the Democrats considering running for governor, whether you are, you're Woody Myers, you've announced, you're Carly Macer, more likely going to get in, Eddie Melton, still trying to decide. How do you run against someone like an Eric Holcomb? For the most part, the governor is sitting in 50 plus of approval ratings, $10 million in the bank.
Well, you got to bring that approval rating down. And again, it's the thesis of the campaign. There's a line I love about chess that applies to politics. Every game of chess is a fierce argument about how chess should be played. And Carly Macer or Woody Myers is going to have their argument about why the Democrats should be in and Eric Holcomb should be out. Carly Macer is going to center it on the Veterans Affairs Department and the flights with the spectacle gaming folks and the other things that she's listed in that litany. Woody Myers has indicated so far that it might be more centered on teacher pay and education and health care. You decide in any campaign what's a winning argument, and sometimes what you decide in September is different from what you thought it was going to be in June, but it will be about what argument they think will play, and they'll be doing polling, and they'll seeing whether it is playing or not.
Well, and I think it's interesting, too, that something that, we obviously talk about this IG report, and, since we're in the thick of it all the time, we think it's interesting and worth talking about and reporting on. But to the average voter in the small town in Indiana, I bet they don't know about this. And so, to what the campaigns are going to have to focus on, I'm not sure if this would be a winning strategy or not. It might be. If you throw in the Veterans Affairs and all the other things, I think you could build something there, but they're going to have to decide what's going to appeal to voters.
Well, but one issue that is always on the topic of respect to education is the issue of back to school. Now that Hoosier kids are going back to school this week and next week, in addition to that, the issues of education continue, whether it's teacher pay, teacher shortages, adequate classroom funding. Where do you all see the issue of teacher pay going? We got a couple of commissions that should be getting ready to start some public hearings around the issue. Adam, we'll start with you.
Well, full disclosure, my wife is a teacher in Carmel and a public school teacher, and she's starting her 12th year next Monday, and I'm really proud of her for staying in a profession that, as a special education teacher that grounds people out after only, 5 years. So my sense is that education in Indiana on the whole it has really improved over the last 2 decades, thanks to a lot of thoughtful legislation and reform efforts by both Democrats and Republicans. And Indiana is really a capital of education reform. It does seem to me that moving into 2020, that there is sort of going to be a backlash, more so than in previous years past, on charter schools. When you look at some of the Democratic candidates, former President Barack Obama and his Secretary of Education early on, Arne Duncan, were very pro-charter movement, and we're not seeing that kind of animus on the Democratic side right now. And so I do think there's going to be a little bit of blowback that we're going to see in 2020 on that. But overall, I think that more dollars are heading to the classroom than ever before. I think education is strong. I do think, teacher pay is a big question mark. Whether that money that was approved is actually going to make it into raises for teachers is something that I'm going to be watching over the next few months.
It's interesting because a study is scheduled to come out by our friends over at the Indiana Fiscal Policy Institute. They actually looked at personnel dollars spent by school districts, how many get into the classroom, how don't, and they found on average only about 47% of the money spent on school personnel is actually spent on a classroom teacher. Does news like that, Eric, do you think factors into this equation when we have these discussions about teacher pay and particularly whether the state is doing enough to increase the pay of teachers?
Well, the Fiscal Policy Institute report sort of dovetails with what the legislature did this session, where they said, okay, we're not forcing you to spend 80% of your money on teachers, but if you don't, we want you to explain why and lay it out there. Again, it's disclosure requirements in another form. So, yeah, it's unsurprising that a lot of them are below that mark, and some of them may have very good reasons why they need to spend money on the air conditioning or what have you. But one of the challenges of this whole issue is you've got, 308 different school districts around the state, give or take a couple, and they've got different budgetary situations and different tax bases, and for that matter, different staff levels in terms of experience on staff. All of that affects it. It's tough to come up with something that threads the needle. That commission, as you mentioned, is holding its first public meetings this month. We'll see what they come out with in time for next year's session.
Lindsey, I know one thing that some folks had wondered, would there be any sort of, although Indiana teachers technically can't strike, any sort of job action taken by some school districts or teachers in some school districts across the state. To the best of my knowledge, haven't seen or heard much of anything. What does that tell you?
We really haven't. We saw, during the session, some teachers and representatives from schools come to the State House.
Ed for Red.
There was a big rally on a Saturday, which I think some of us kind of questioned and thought, well, that makes sense, yes, because you're teachers and you have to be in school during the week. But lawmakers aren't there on Saturdays, so, how big of an impact is that going to have? I think it's a conversation we're going to keep having about teacher pay and K through 12 funding, because I'm just, as things evolve, things get more expensive. There's just so many variables that I just don't think this topic is going anywhere. And even if we see teacher pay increase in however many school districts, I'm sure there will still be some where teacher pay didn't increase, and those districts will bring that up and those teachers will bring that up. So,
Eric.
It's worth noting, this is not an issue that the ISTA brought to the fore. This is an issue that Brian Bosma dropped at the beginning of the session after talking privately with the ISTA over the summer. This was not something where there was a job action or pressure. We were seeing it in other states, and I think this is a case of Brian Bosma trying to get ahead of the curve. And so I think the reason you've not had job actions is the ISTA and IFT are saying, okay, we believe you're negotiating in good faith. We don't see the results yet, but we're willing to accept what you've done so far, and we want to see some results. Eric Holcomb has said 2020 is when we see some results, when we have a commission report and a new set of proposals and then a 2021 budget to deal with those. At that point, they're going to expect somebody to deliver, but I think they're giving the administration and the legislature some rope here.
Real quickly before we close up shop here, Adam, nationally, how does the teacher pay issue play out amongst the Democratic candidates for president?
Yeah, I think almost every candidate has made favorable comments about increasing teacher pay. I think you've seen South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg say that teachers ought to be paid like they should be paid like doctors and honored like military service people. So
no lawyers?
But I don't really see, to be honest with you, I don't really see education being a significant issue in the 2020 race. It hasn't gotten any. I don't think there's been a single debate question in the first two Democratic debates about education, and it seems like even though there's that backlash against charters, it's something that we're not hearing a lot about.
All right. Well, as we get ready, before we wrap up, we always close out Indiana issues with political prognostications and predictions. We got about 60 seconds and some change. Eric, what are you paying attention to? What should our audience be looking out for?
Watching the 5th District, we've got a few high-profile Democratic candidates already in the field. The Republicans have been very quiet, although there's a couple who have filed there. I'm looking to see who else jumps in there, and I suspect we'll start seeing that over the next few months.
I was also going to say, watching 2020 and seeing what candidates start to pop up. It's about that time. So
I'm going to the Iowa State Fair next Tuesday to follow Pete Buttigieg, and it's really important to me that I get an answer to this question: which state has the better tenderloin sandwich, Iowa or Indiana? And I'm not going to let him weasel out of it. So
look at the next couple of weeks for the first independent media poll, Indianapolis mayor's race, as well as a few other things done by our friends at Indiana Issues and Indy Politics. So, hey, got to do the shameless plug. Our guests today have been our good friends Eric Berman, Network Indiana, Lindsey Erdody from the Indianapolis Business Journal, and Adam Wren of Importantville and Politico. Special thanks to our friends here at Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz. You've been watching Indiana Issues. We'll talk to you next time.